Hello and welcome to today's virtual panel discussion on the topic of how medical device classification and identification impact the device lifecycle. I'm Angela Alexandro, Marketing Manager for ReedTech Life Sciences. Today's multi-speaker panel will focus on different approaches to product classification and how we can use that identification as a means to find similar devices and also help with making data-driven decisions. The panel speakers have a wealth of experience on this topic. This should be a really lively, fun discussion. Plenty of room at the end to take your questions, so please feel free to submit them at any time in the questions panel in the GoToWebinar dashboard. The speakers are going to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their organizations, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion on a series of related questions. And at the end, we will address any questions that are submitted by you, so please do submit them at any time. We are recording and everyone will receive a follow-up email with links to review the on-demand recording. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to our moderator, Rachel Benway.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation. So as Angela said, we're going to do introductions for all of us, then we'll do the discussion questions, and then we'll take any questions from the audience. I apologize if there's any background noise from me. The landscapers are in my development, so I'll try to go on mute whenever I am not speaking. So to start, we're going to hear from Mark Wasmuth from the GMVN agency.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark. I'm from GMVN. Today we're going to be talking about a whole range of things, but as a way of introduction, GMVN, as you may know, is a requirement for the Good ID database. Nomenclatures, like all nomenclatures or classification systems, they're basically used to group products which do similar things or have similar characteristics. Some, like the GMVN, is primarily in a post-market area where we're looking to track characteristics of products to help regulators and medical device users to better understand the use of the device, whether that's by the patient or whether that's anyway something related to post-market. Other types of classification systems you'll come across may be used more in the pre-market space. Certainly things like pro codes that are used by FDA to help them categorize products, part of that pre-market space. And there are other systems, of course, used around the world for similar purposes. My introductory slides really just go to clarify a little bit about the GMVN and how we can look at data and cut through the data to make more sense of that. So we got the next slide, please, Rachel. You'll be familiar with barcoding, the UDI on the product packaging. This slide really just clarifies the fact that the GMVN is used to group similar type devices which may be made by different manufacturers and obviously identified individually, but also grouped together using the same GMVN term. Okay, thanks. So next one, Rachel, please. Here we can see a case where we've looked at a range of data from adverse incidents. This data was collected from the US FDA MORD database, and we can look at a section of products, in this case orthopedic implants, and then dig down and group them by type so we can see which ones we might want to investigate in a little bit more detail, or which ones might indicate to us there may be a problem, maybe not with the device, maybe about the way the device is used. Okay, thanks. Next one then, please, Rachel. So here's some examples of another set of data. This case, it's also implants, and we can, of course, if we can track this information by time, we can group products, similar products together, and we can see how those products might be changed in use through a time base. And that's quite interesting if you want to see who might be the perhaps dominant supplier in a particular marketplace. Okay, next one, please, Rach. So really, my last slide is something to do with much more about with keeping up to date. One of the important things about the Good ID database is that we try and make sure that we provide a GMVN description which is relevant and keeps up to date with the change in innovation. And one of the points I think we want to make today is if you're managing data, if you're managing submissions, you need to have a look, think about the process for keeping information up to date on that database. And how would you do that? How would you receive information internally in your organization? How do you process that? And how do you then output that to the relevant register of products? So that's a really quick introduction on the GMVN. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Mark. Next, we'll hear from Tom Risch from Greenlight.Guru.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom. I work as a medical device guru at Greenlight.Guru. And so first off, I just want to say thanks to the ReedTech team for inviting us at Greenlight to be part of this. I'm excited to dig into the topics today, and I'll focus more on the quality side and how we can use quality management systems strategically to help you out with some of the identification. A little bit about me to start off with. I spent about 10 years in the orthopedic industry prior to coming to, and I was mostly a product development engineer, so worked on developing instruments and implants for total knee systems. I worked at a large organization where we had a big UDI project to get up to speed with some of the UDI, so started getting into some of the UDI identification stuff there. I also went to a startup where we were working on a class 3 device in the US that we were able to get a CE mark on first, and learned a lot about MDN and some of the identification. I know we're all waiting UDAMED. So overall, what I do is I help companies get their QMS implemented and just stay organized as they look to get their products to market. A little bit about our company, Greenlight.Guru. On the next slide here, we are a med device specific quality management system. So we're cloud-based. We try to get organizations working together in this collaborative environment where they can manage their documentation, their design controls, their risk, a lot of the post-market activities as you're tracking some of your devices to the field. And so we, as mentioned, we focus only on med device, and our goal is to get you up and moving and get an efficient quality system. And if you have any questions or would like to learn more, you can always visit our website to learn about that. This talks a little bit more. I guess I'll dive in a little bit. You're looking at a design control matrix here, but we meet the regulations. So it is built to comply with Part 820, 1345, ISO 14971. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Tom. So next we'll hear from John from ReedTech.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll also apologize in advance if you hear a child screaming in the background if he wakes up. We're in prime wake up from nap time, but let's see how this goes. So I'm John Lawrence. I've been with ReedTech for quite some time, specifically working within the life sciences industry, supporting electronic submissions. More recently, I've been representing ReedTech in MedTech Europe, working towards the UDAMED initiative, focusing on the UDI module for device registration. Some past experience I have as well is in the pharma space for electronic registration and listing, but I'm going to be really here to contribute to the discussion from the perspective of the submission to these global registries, specifically for UDI. Next slide, we get a little bit into ReedTech in general. So ReedTech has been around since the early 60s. We're located right outside of Philadelphia, but with some offices also in Virginia and the Netherlands. We're part of the LexisNexis and Relics group of companies. We've actually, prior to getting into life sciences at ReedTech, we've been supporting the United States Patent Office since 1970 providing the patent processing, composition, and databases that drive the USPTO. But it was back in over 15 years ago now, we got into the life sciences industry, again, originally supporting pharmaceutical electronic submissions, but then branching into medical device with UDI at the advent of the US FDA Good ID. To date, we've worked with over 1,000 medical device and pharmaceutical companies, and upon doing so, we've been working through some of the organizations that you see at the bottom of your screen. On the next slide, we'll get into a little bit about specifically for medical devices and from my area with working with the UDI registries. There's a lot going on. There's a lot that has been done, that continues to be done, previously done for the US. We're working on for EU, as previously mentioned, but we have many regions that are either implementing their own initiative, planning for it, or they have it ongoing. So you could probably, you replace anyone in that picture in the center of all those flags with all the activity going on. Anyone that's working in medical device that has to do with UDI, it's like, wow, it's going to just keep coming. So I just wanted to highlight some of the common challenges that we see. And again, this will be from the perspective of the UDI submissions, but same for the different regulations that impact your labeling and such with UDI. From a product attribution standpoint, each region is going to have unique attributes requested. Unfortunately, it's not really the same list for every region. Perhaps initially when you hear they're doing UDI, okay, they're going to know their primary identifier, their brand name, the description, and so forth. But there's some things that are regionally specific that we find. And even the attributes that are commonly requested, they actually could have values that vary upon region. So it might not be the actual same value of that attribute. The validation rules for the submission. It's very important to understand what the downstream databases are expecting with respect to data quality and format, and specifically in the area of UDI triggers, meaning if a particular attribute has to change and be updated, you would have to actually assign a new identifier as opposed to be able to maintain your attribution for an existing identifier. And we'll get into that a little bit later with respect to GMVN. Different standards are being used, so this is a global unique. It really is a unique standard each time we implement it. It's uniquely done. So there's HL7 SPL utilized in the US. The EU is using a different XML schema. We're seeing JSON API submissions for China, South Korea, and so forth. So a lot of differences within each implementation, and then of course the ongoing change management once you do implement. So on the next slide, I'll just briefly touch on where ReedTech plays in this area, if you will. We have a product, ReedTech Single Source for Medical Devices, which we've developed to support these ongoing initiatives with respect to managing the data. Basically, we host the data and we're able to validate it against the particular business rules that are important for the regions that you would be submitting for. We've been submitting for the US FDA. I think it was about getting close to 25% of the FDA good IDs actually came through ReedTech. And we're also actively participating in the pilots for UDIMED for EU UDI, and in the process of building out those connections for China, South Korea, and so forth. You name it, we have that on our plate. So with ReedTech Single Source is really to be that one-stop shop partner on helping you deal with all this fun with implementing the new submission requirements. Hey, Rachel.
Yep, thanks, John. So I'm going to be moderating, but I'll also be participating. So I just wanted to give you a little intro into who I am. So I have a biomedical engineering degree from Drexel University and a master's in health information management from Temple University. I've been working in healthcare technology for over 10 years. And I've been with ReedTech for about 4 years now, which is really exciting, working mostly in the medical device space, but getting a little bit into the pharmaceutical side now also. I am also a PADI dive master, so it's hard for me right now in this COVID environment to be stuck in the US, can't travel and do what I usually like to be doing on the weekends. So I'm making the best of it.
Well, you definitely have the coolest picture out of all of us.
Thanks. In other circumstances, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about diving for hours. So send me a message. So at ReedTech, though, I've been working on an application called ReedTech Navigator for medical devices. That's been my main focus for the majority of the time I've been with ReedTech. It can help medical device companies do regulatory intelligence, risk management, and post-market surveillance. A lot of that has to do with product classification and being able to find similar devices through those different classification hierarchies. So as you may know, there are many different data sets available that contain information on medical devices and can help with use cases such as risk analysis, regulatory intelligence, and post-market surveillance. But it is a time-consuming process to comb through those sources. This is magnified by the fact that these databases are not very user-friendly and can be very difficult to search successfully. Furthermore, the data is not normalized or standardized, which prevents trending and benchmarking. To overcome these barriers, we've built Navigator, which connects over a dozen sources, including the FDA approvals and clearances and event data like adverse events, recalls, and warning letters. We use GMVN, UDIs, device listings, and product code information to categorize the products and events. Additionally, we assemble all references to a particular product into a single entry. The word cloud on the right shows how many variations on a single product name and manufacturer are possible. This is an example modeled after actual variations of a real product in the MOD database. So with this application, we put a big focus on user experience, allowing you to quickly and easily search for Class 2 and 3 medical device products and research adverse event reports, recalls, and warning letters for each product. It will let you, from a web browser on your laptop, tablet, or even your smartphone, view trends and benchmarks of key safety and quality metrics. You can even do head-to-head comparisons of similar products. So if you want to look at your product versus your competitors or look across different products within your portfolio, you can do all of that. So I'm definitely going to be talking about some of that types of research and product classifications that we use in Navigator, but you can always reach out if you want to hear more information about any of the products or what we do at each of these companies. So now we'll get into the panel. The first question that we have for the panel is, during the initial stages of bringing a medical device to life, what are the most important considerations a device manufacturer should have regarding device classification?
I have to learn not to turn my mic on mute before between slides. So yeah, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, when we're thinking about certainly about our own classification, so when you're submitting your data to the regulator as part of a product listing, certainly you need to sort of think about, have I got the right description for my product? Does the classification system actually match what I consider to be a good description of my product? And if it doesn't, then certainly contact us and talk about that issue. We run a free inquiry service for any manufacturer that's got a concern that the GMVN description isn't appropriate for their product, and we're happy to help to make sure that's correct. GMVN should be representative of what's being made at any one time. So that's really what I would say at the present time.
And I think GMVN can be pretty specific, but other hierarchies like the FDA product code can be more generic. Sometimes when you're doing a crosswalk between those, a GMVN term can cover multiple product codes, and sometimes vice versa. So I think for GMVN specifically, it covers things even like materials, they get very specific like that, whereas some of the FDA product codes might cover materials, but not all of them. So it's important to look at the device holistically like that, right?
Yeah, one thing I'd add on that, Rachel, is that you know, the GMVN is designed that one term should describe the product you've got in front of you, whereas the pro codes, the FDA pro codes, are more attribute related, and you might have more than one for your particular product, depending on the particular type of product and the way it's designed, the way it's maybe packaged. So that's something to be aware of. You might find you have 2 or 3 pro codes for your product, but you should only really have one GMVN term that describes the particular product you have in front of you.
Yeah, and I would add, I talk to a lot of people that are in this early stage where they have an idea and they haven't gone and looked at GMVN codes or even like thought about their indications for use or intended use fully. And that's where some of those databases are good to just go through and start building out that description so that you get ahead of the regulatory side and the classification versus waiting till later.
Yeah, I agree with getting ahead, definitely from a UDI registration perspective as well, as early as you could have a look as to what, depending on which markets you're going to be selling the device, what are the different market requirements with respect to the UDI databases, just so nothing surprises you as you look at it many times as the last mile of making the registration to the good ID, but to just know what you're in for once you do get to that stage.
Yeah, we often have companies come to us with quite quite short delivery times for data. As you say, what John says there, they've left it a bit late in finding out what information is required for a particular market. You can come to us as early as you like and start looking for data related to GMVN. I would advise start early and for each market you're particularly looking at any one time.
And Tom, what you said about looking at indications for use and things like that, I think you can definitely use the 510K database for that. So that kind of brings us to our next question, which is device classification with the FDA is directly tied to both CFR numbers and device class. So what are the implications for a device based off of the chosen device classification? So when you look at FDA product codes specifically, they're tied directly to the FDA device classes, 1, 2, or 3, which are tied directly to the regulatory pathways. So if you're looking at a riskier device and you're looking at those possible FDA product codes, it's probably going to be a class 3, which will be a PMA device or a PMA application to the FDA for approval. Class 2 product codes will most likely be a 510K, and you'll have to find those predicate devices, which are devices that have the same intended use or indications for use. And class 1s, most likely a UDI submission is the only thing that will be required. If you are looking through all these FDA product codes and you can't find one that you feel like really fits the device that you're trying to bring to market, you might need to apply for a new code. That will probably be as part of a de novo submission to the FDA if that's a less risky device, or as part of the PMA application if it's a riskier class 3 device. Once you figure out what that classification is going to be and that regulatory pathway, it can be helpful because you can find applicable guidance documents, which is usually based off of the product code or the CFR number associated with that type of device. And that can give you insights into things like labeling, testing that's going to be required. There are guidances, so it's not required by the FDA, but it's highly suggested, and it can be helpful for really knowing exactly what the FDA is going to be looking for when you talk to them about that device. Device class just one other thing. So the device class assigned to the product code can change over time, but the regulatory pathway that you have to follow is going to be based off of whatever that current designation is. So I've seen product codes that used to be class 2s that are now class 3s. They require a PMA now, but also things that have been downgraded to a class 2 because they're better understood now. Sorry, Tom, what were you going to say?
No, sorry for cutting you off. I was going to add, there really is a wealth of information there that you touched on. I know I didn't utilize it to its full potential, but you give that FDA product code database. There are summaries of 510Ks and sometimes even like redacted 510Ks where if you find a similar device, it lays out some of the testing that they've maybe done, performance or clinical testing. So it really gives you a good idea, again, going back to getting ahead of things. You know, what type of testing or what type of pathway do I need to start preparing for, knowing it could change, but at least a good starting point.
There's definitely tools out there that can help. As we know, the FDA sites are not always the friendliest to use. So there are some tools that help with looking through that 510K database for indications for use and intended use, including Navigator, but we're not the only one in that space. So, a lot of times those indications for use and intended uses are hidden inside the PDFs, like you were saying, those summary documents. So even though it's kind of the most important thing to match on when you're looking for a predicate or a similar device, you can't search that way on the FDA site, but there are other solutions that could help with that. Anything else about regulation?
No.
Okay. So question number 3, can a device manufacturer ever reclassify a device? If so, what does that process look like? So actually still a little bit about regulatory, I'll just comment quickly. So depending on the change and what type of approval that device had originally, it will probably require some sort of notice to the FDA about the change. So if it was a class 2, you'll probably want to submit a 510K special. And if it's a class 3 with a PMA supplement. So that can be smaller things like a labeling change or a name change, or larger things like something happened in the manufacturing process to possibly a classification or a material change. But if it was, depending on how significant the change was, you might have to submit a whole new application and not just a supplement or a special.
Correct, and that from a UDI perspective with registration, the intent is really to align with that. That's the intent. So from a US Good ID perspective, you can update, you could, beyond the device being published in the registry, you can make changes. You could add, delete, and edit the attribute for GMVN. So that's a good thing, meaning it wouldn't trigger a new device identifier to be assigned, basically a new record to be submitted. You maintain the existing record, but if there's other changes to that device that are involved with the reclassification, then perhaps you would have to go that route with having, if you're going through a whole new application, you're probably changing other things that you're going to have to, from the database perspective, it's a whole new device submission. But it's an attribute to keep an eye on as additional regions implement UDI. Back to my intro when I was talking about the new DI triggers. We really want those to be consistent region to region, so you don't have particular GTINs or HIBIT codes for only certain regions when it's really the same product that's being registered. So we're hoping to avoid that at all costs, but there's probably going to be things that could potentially cause a trigger. So you would unfortunately have to maintain different identifiers for regions, but let's hope that never happens. But just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, it's from my experience with the GMVN, I think the US has got quite a good system. Certainly allows updates to GMVN coding if we happen to change a code group, which is great. That there's no penalty there in terms of having to change your DIs. And we try quite hard to explain the benefits of the US system globally. But sometimes the regulators, they just don't want to hear. They get on to do their own thing. You know, we try to make a harmonized system. I know GS1 and HIBIC both work hard globally to try and get regulators to adopt a similar model. It doesn't always work, and we have to go back and renegotiate. You know, we are actually working for manufacturers to try and get the world a much more consistent place using the same standards. It doesn't always work.
Mark, when people come to you and they have questions, or maybe they're looking to change the classification that they chose, is it usually because they kind of made a mistake and didn't understand originally, or there was really a change that they've made to the device?
Well, when we're talking about GMVN terms and kind of the post-market area for product registration, the GMVN really, I suppose there's a couple of scenarios. It might be they've come to us perhaps a bit early in their development cycle. We try to encourage manufacturers to come as late as possible, so they pretty much know what their intended use is, and that's pretty clamped down. But we understand that the manufacturers, you know, sometimes don't know the complete intended use for their product until quite late. So we understand that's sometimes a problem we have to manage. But most often, you know, devices are pretty well locked down by the time that they come to us, which is a good thing. Reclassification devices, it doesn't really affect us. The GMVN kind of sits above the risk classes, so there's not a direct link. It is a problem sometimes because different jurisdictions have different ways of classifying devices. So one jurisdiction might be slightly, maybe one risk class different from another. Again, I think as time goes on, as we start to use, if we start to be more consistent globally in the way we describe devices, the way devices are maybe evaluated, maybe under a single audit program, I think the differences between jurisdictions will get ironed out. I think at the moment it's a little bit uncertain because each different jurisdiction, each different sort of country or region has a slightly different approach, a national approach. But I think eventually we're going to get a situation where globalization will catch up and we will get better harmonization rules between different locations. So I think all this information we're creating under devices really helps. It really will help to accelerate that progress towards global harmonization.
Okay, I think we're ready for the next question. So number 4, what considerations are there for a device manufacturer when thinking about how to store and maintain device information?
Okay, so I'll probably sound like a broken record when I keep talking about the new DI triggers, but I think that's very important. So ultimately understanding your data. With the US good ID, we're at, you know, upper 50, you have upper 50s, lower 60s, number of attributes. You know, in South Korea, 50 odd attributes, half of those perhaps are crossover with the US. With Europe, you know, you're over 100 because now you have the additional layer of the basic UDI and associated attribution at that level. So understanding if you're working on a new initiative, where are you going to store it and who's going to own it? You know, establishing some data governance over that information is very important because there are, although it may appear that UDI, okay, it's the last step, I'm going to just register this information with the database and I'm done, and I'm going to like wipe my hands of it and just go on and do something else. You have to just continue monitoring the regulations regionally. Perhaps there's going to be new terminology and such that's going to be released that's going to help better describe your device. Many times the regulator will say, well, they won't perhaps force you to update immediately, but think about the downstream usage of the information. You know, the goal is to just submit this information to say that, okay, I completed this one regulatory requirement. The goal is to have these devices identified uniquely throughout the globe, so the information can be relied on and used in healthcare systems, hospital networks. Patients can see the information. So it's really important to ensure that you're keeping it current, and not to look at it as just a submission you make in time, but then a year later someone looks at it and it's just not accurate. From a U.S. example, something that we saw was the catalog number was not required to be included in the FDA Good ID submission. So there was instances where folks didn't include that in their submission to the FDA because it wouldn't fail validation. Okay, it's optional. But really, at times when the regulator is stating something as being optional, and I think the FDA perhaps even backtracked on that wording eventually and said we should have said if applicable or if available, like they want that information. And what happened was there was a situation where hospitals were trying to tap into the Good ID and utilize that information. They're like, this is great. Here's a standardized set of information that's finally available. It's not information that's coming in through PDF submissions or so forth. And then they go in and they're looking for devices and they can't find them. And they're like, where is it? This catalog number wasn't consistently utilized, and it actually slowed down the adoption of some of that usage. So then the FDA, along with other industry members, we went on this initiative to encourage folks to update their submissions to include those catalog numbers and ensure that they included accurate catalog numbers so that we could eliminate a problem and hopefully eliminate challenges like that going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the FDA had done a terrific job in launching, the better use of UDI. I know there's also providers that are, starting to use the data. There's still some quality issues there. Certainly looking at some of the data in detail, some of the device descriptions aren't great, so that can be improved upon. I think each different country, as they start to adopt it, like a UDI solution, I think they will learn from each other, and I think the use of UDI is a definite improvement in terms of getting more data about the product, not only in terms of the products on the market, but how they're used, how they're recorded in patient records, how they're reported back in terms of incidents. So lots of data to come, and there's no real looking back. I think it's to look forward and make more use of this quality data, and in that way also improve the data as time goes on.
Yeah.
And just kind of, it's important to understand the history of your device and have a record of all of that information. Just in case the FDA comes knocking, they can ask for all different types of information. So, if there's a recall or a inspection, they could want to see certain types of information, see the history of the device. So it's important to be able to pull up that information quickly, know where it lives, have a process for all of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even if you're in a situation where you have a handful of devices and it is rather static, let's say, very mature products, you're submitting UDI electronically, you're creating electronic records and submitting those to regulatory authorities. So it's probably a good idea that that's maintained in a controlled fashion. All the initial submissions, so forth, had an audit trail applied with it and all that. I'm sure if there's any quality colleagues on the line or what have you, the expectations are probably pretty high for maintaining that in a controlled fashion.
Yeah. I'd like to add one thing also. I mean, over the years, we've seen, the GMVN is used in something over 90 countries now, and we've seen as companies have joined us as members sometimes, that they've had a number of different, if they're a multinational or maybe they've got agents in many countries, each agent might be joining and using a slightly different code to assign to the product which they have in front of them, or they would have to distribute into a particular jurisdiction. I think we're seeing a lot more consistency of management now. We're seeing certainly companies consolidating the management of their data much more centrally. They're using tools such as what you provide to manage the data in a much more consistent way. So consistency is great because it means that they're using the same code globally for all of the target markets.
Great. Okay, I think we're ready for the next question. So number 5, how does regulatory information like device classification and device identification play a part in the quality management program?
No, to start, quality management systems can be quite overwhelming or daunting. I look at ISO 1345 and FDA Part 820, and there's a lot in there. Our philosophy at Greenlight is to really, we say, right size your quality management system or focus on the things that are applicable to you. The device classification plays a big role in that. So I know for class 1 devices, for example, the FDA says you need to control documents, you need to track complaints. And so you would focus your QMS around some procedures like that, but maybe not put as much into design controls, for example. The EU MDR is adding some more requirements around technical documentation that you're going to want to check to make sure that your QMS covers those. As you get up to higher class devices, though, you know, design controls, risk management, all of those are going to play a big role into getting your product to market. I know with some of the class 3, you're going to have trials and studies, and you're going to want to make sure you're collecting the right data, storing it in a way that you have access to it. And even with some of this tracking, you know, I know I've worked at companies where we didn't have good procedures in place for our barcodes or our labeling, and we were just redoing it every time or relearning it each time, and we'd go to different websites and try to research it. But one thing we finally did after a while is implement a process for what's the right way to put on this barcode, identify the codes that you need for your devices in the different regions. And so, you know, we want to focus on the aspects of the quality management system that make sense to you, and the device classification is going to tell you, you know, we only need a subset or we need a lot more than that.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot more emphasis in the future, certainly with the European MDR, much more about evidence-based risk management. So looking at comparative devices, you know, even looking at clinical studies. Those clinical studies could be comparative products, not necessarily your own product. So a lot more searching will be required to demonstrate that your product is not only with the MDR, not only safe, but effective. There's much more emphasis on effectiveness. And that also is part of the quality management system that we have for medical devices.
Yeah, that's a great point. The data is important on the clinical side, and we have a lot of our customers that are really bolstering their post-market surveillance procedures as well because of EU MDR initiatives to make sure you're tracking performance and comparing it to the rest of the industry. So great point, Mark.
And that kind of leads into the next question, which is, the FDA started requiring UDIs for some devices as early as 2015 with the intent to adequately identify devices sold in the US from manufacturing through distribution to patient use. Have you seen any impact to the post-market device reporting procedures since the implementation of UDI? So I'll definitely start with this one. And just say that, you know, the hope was and still is that the implementation of UDIs will make it easier to track devices throughout the entire life cycle, including recalls, adverse events, and warning letters. I have started seeing UDIs being added to the detailed information on recalls and adverse events, but it's hard to do anything of significance with them right now. There isn't a designated field on the recall report or the adverse events, and definitely not in the user interfaces So when you look at a recall that might have UDIs listed on them, they're all kind of in a big chunk of text. Sometimes they're separated by a space, sometimes by a comma, sometimes by a semicolon. So it's kind of hard to recognize them, and sometimes they're just, submitted in the same field along with catalog numbers and other, manufacturer identifiers. And as we know, UDIs themselves can come in multiple different formats depending on, who issued the UDI. So right now it's hard for us to, gather them in a meaningful way, and then take them and try to look up other device information based off of that UDI. We're hoping at some point it will get to that point. We can definitely look at stuff more manually with what we have now to see what's going on, but not in a long-term sense. I did go to a conference earlier this year before all the lockdown started, that AdvaMed ran in DC, and there was a representative from the FDA who works in the recall department there. I asked her specifically about this issue, about that those UDIs, and like everything, it takes time and money was basically her answer. So hopefully, eventually they will prioritize this, because it will be really useful for doing that risk management and post-market surveillance comparisons if we can really get accurate information on a specific device and its history of adverse events and its history of recalls, even linking it back to what type of approval it had. If it was the specific PMA or the specific 510K that was used to approve that device. Having those unique device identifiers will really make all of those linkages much easier, instead of relying on the name and the manufacturer of those devices along with the product code. So I still have hope that it will happen, but not quite yet.
Yep. Yeah, it seems to be one step at a time with the FDA, which is stark contrast to what we see with Europe with UDIMED, where it's basically end-to-end full-blown system. But at the same time, the FDA database is live with device information, and we're still waiting for UDIMED. So there's pros and cons, I guess, with that approach, where with UDIMED, everything ultimately has to be fully functional and available for that to fully be enforced. Whereas, so you're kind of waiting on other pieces and modules to go into place before you could even start, registering your UDI information. Whereas, the FDA, they were able to start at least just capturing, getting the data. So yeah, I'm very hopeful for that as well to come on the FDA side soon.
I mean, it makes me, I definitely think we're in the right direction. It makes me happy to see that people are even submitting them on recalls, even before there's like a designated space for them. I think that means that people are trying to do, the right thing, trying to include that information. So, if we can link to the UDI correctly, then we can get things like the GMVN terms off of the UDI record, which will make things like comparisons much easier. So we could do more trending. So if we can, match adverse events directly to the GMVN terms that are associated with those products, you can look more directly at different types of failure modes that might be common for particular device types or materials, since things like that are included in those GMVN details. When I talk to customers, a lot of times the FDA product code may be too broad. It covers, their competitors, but so many others that they don't consider their competitors. So it's hard to do that risk management or true comparison just off of the product code information.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an example of the fact that you use the pro code for your pre-market activity, for your classifying the product, and that's where that's used, and that's why the GMVN uses for the post-market space. But in terms of coming back to the question, there's an incredible amount of data now that we're starting to look at. We're starting to now be able, for the first time, to look at large data sets and accurately group products and look at the characteristics. And of course, the FDA UDI program isn't quite complete yet. We've still got another deadline this summer. That might be delayed, I don't know, but still a deadline for the low-risk products. And there's a lot of low-risk products out there as well. So Hopefully it won't be too long before we've got a complete data set, and that data set I know is growing every month or every day. So there's more and more data being collected, and I think it's a really positive step forward to start looking at this data, start analysing in much more detail, and looking at the big picture for medical device safety.
Now I was muted. Any other comments on this question? So that was all of the questions that we had prepared for the panel. Angela, are there any questions from the audience? Remember, you can still submit questions on things that we commented on, other questions you may have about product classification throughout the device lifecycle.
Sure, we do have a couple of questions, and I should point out that we do have an SSI master diver who identified himself, so props to Rachel on her accomplishments with that. Yeah, a couple questions here. For GMVN, how is similarity determined, and who determines this?
That's a good question. We've been developing the GMVN for well over 20 years. The medtech space is very, very diverse. If you think of the technology all the way from one end, you've got nanoparticles, the other end, you've got air ambulances, everything in between, every technology. It's very difficult to work out that. I would say we do our best to try and work through the, obviously we're not starting from the beginning, we're starting halfway through. So adding more product groups or products into the grouping isn't so difficult because we're matching it in with what we have already. And that's how we basically, when a company comes to us with their project, we look at that, we look at the products on the market of similar products, and we look at the terms we have, and we see how we can best fit that in. That might mean that we just advise on an existing term. We might modify description to include that new variant. We only modify to include additional variants, that we don't make the group smaller. Or we might decide we need to make a new term because that particular customer is innovating in a new way. If we need advice, we contact any number of regulators that we're on regular contact with. That might be the FDA, that might be the MHRA in the UK, that could be TGA in Australia. There's a whole range of regulators which we have that work with us and help us improve the quality of our GMVN terms. So that's what we try to do. We also then, if you've got an inquiry, we have a public area on the website, so other manufacturers can comment on a particular new project we're doing. We don't reveal information that is provided to us by the original applicant. That's all confidential, but we do have an open procedure so others can comment on new projects. So that's how we go about that.
Okay, great. This next question could be for really anyone on the panel. Where is the best place to start with device classification?
So I'll make a few comments on that. So there is a FDA product classification database on the FDA website, and you can search that by a few key terms if you don't know what classification you want yet. We also mentioned looking at the 510(k) database by intended use or indications for use for your device, and that kind of can give you a good idea of what the product code might be. For that, it's only going to show you class 2 products, unfortunately, and so you can also look at the PMA database for the class 3s. It kind of is a little bit of a hodgepodge unless you want to kind of use a tool like Navigator or some other tool. As we talked about a little bit, starting earlier, starting late in the process, but you need to kind of have at least some idea of what the product's going to look like and feel like and be made of, and what's its intended use before you can really make those selections. But the FDA has some good tools. You can download the entire FDA product code database as an Excel file and kind of play around with it and see kind of what the options are. GMVN has a great website. You can reach out to them. I think you've made parts of the database public now, I believe, for people to look at.
That's right. GMVN is free to access.
So I think, you know, kind of getting a good handle on those hierarchies and what they look like, what they feel like, what the kind of the options are is a good place to start.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, on the CE mark side, or the MDR has an annex that really gives, it's almost like a flow chart or a series of rules that goes through to say, you know, like, are we an invasive device or not, or what do we do this or this, and it really walks you through the process to get to your classification. So I know different people have different opinions on what's easier, FDA or CE mark. I think identifying your class, the MDR lays it out pretty easily.
Okay, great. Next question. If a product has a GMVN code, is it a medical device?
Wow, that's a really good question, because we're asked this quite a lot. It's not necessarily a medical device as defined within your jurisdiction, because globally, unfortunately, regulators sometimes have a difference of opinion. Clearly, there are cultural differences in different parts of the world. So some products are classified as medical equipment, sometimes they're not. So just because your product has a GMVN description doesn't necessarily mean it's a medical device. You need to really look at your local regulations to get a better insight into that. Now, the reason for that is that what we've been asked for over the years is to make sure that the descriptions used in the provider network really fall. If you imagine you're managing a hospital and you've got not only you've got medical devices, but you've also got other equipment, maybe test equipment, maybe some types of furniture that you're also managing in the same system. So that might be the reason why you'll see descriptions for things in the GMVN, which strictly speaking are not medical devices as defined by the local regulation. But we find they help to they help when managing equipment across the hospital network in that respect. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about the mower in the background, if y'all can hear that. What about the difference between a GMVN term and a GMVN code? Those are two separate things?
Yeah, well, the code is just the number, and the term is the descriptive text. We publish the GMVN in about 27 languages, and so the text will appear obviously in the different languages depending on your language choice, but the code will be the same. Obviously, and that allows you to be consistent across that set. And then of course, codes also help when managing data, large amounts of data. So, the GMVN code is what's stored against the UDI in the Access Good ID database. So that just helps to store that bit of information against each particular UDI DI in that database.
Mark, could the term change slightly, but the code stay the same? Like, could you, if there was even a typo, but even like a slight word change, but the code would stay the same?
It does happen. If we didn't do that, we'd be making lots of terms obsolete and producing new ones. So we do have a rule where we can modify the term name. We can only do that to increase the scope, so it kind of becomes more inclusive, just to perhaps clarify the description a little bit. That does help to keep the numbers of major changes down a bit. We do know changes are always difficult to manage as far as our customers are concerned. We have an update service to make sure people are kept up to date with changes in real time. But I would say it's better to have a system which keeps up to date with the innovation. Otherwise, you end up with a system which is just hopelessly out of date before you know where you are.
All right, great. So it looks like we're running out of time. I do want to thank the panel. This was a really informative and interesting discussion. As always, we will make the recording available very shortly to everyone, and we will invest in some lighting from Mark Wasmuth for his next panel participation.
Keeps going off. I have to keep moving, otherwise the lights go off.
I like that part of it. I like it.
Yeah, so thanks everybody a lot. You see our websites and contact information on the screen. Be safe. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, stay safe. Bye.
Thank you.